Welcome to Shareholder Primacy from Free Float Media, a podcast about activist investing, securities law, and all the ways the financial and legal worlds intersect and collide in real life. I'm here with Ann Lipton, law professor at Tulane in New Orleans, who teaches and researches securities and business law. She holds up, of course, the legal end of our podcast.
And that's Mike Levin, an activist investor who lives and works in Chicago. He covers the financial side of our podcast.
Yes, I do. This week, let's talk about some problems in M&A. Specifically, when an acquirer, a bidder, tries to, take advantage of conflicts of interest among its target companies, officers, and directors. There's plenty of conflicts that exist there, and I guess they can make life interesting for a proposed acquirer.
Yeah. And we'll dive deeper into transactions involving proxy votes, this time to look at the recent empty voting situation involving Massimo and an activist investor.
Yes, that'll be fun to talk about as well. So I take it there's some newer issues that have come up in Delaware, our favorite jurisdiction, about in M&A, about acquiring companies that try to somehow exert some leverage or take advantage over their target by looking at problems with independence and conflicts of interest and so forth among the officers and directors of the target company. And this becomes relevant to activists, of course, because frequently we're agitating for a deal. That's actually, there's a lot of evidence that the most value in an activist situation comes when your activist portfolio company gets acquired. So I'm really kind of curious to sort of see what the latest here is. So what's going on?
Okay, well, just, the background is, corporate managers, just sort of the basics of the corporate managers, the officers and directors, they have, as you know, fiduciary obligations to act in good faith to maximize shareholder wealth.
Fiduciary duty. Yes.
There's fiduciary duty, but there is also a concept of aiding and abetting a fiduciary breach. So that's when they're not a fiduciary, they're not a board member, they're not an officer, but they somehow participate in or induce a fiduciary breach by someone who does have fiduciary obligations. And when that happens, shareholders can sue that person who aided or induced the fiduciary breach, just like they can sue the breaching officer or director. So here's an example. If I went out and I bribed a CEO to get him to direct his company's business to me, to sign a contract with me, the CEO has breached his duty of loyalty. He acted to pursue his own interests by taking this bribe. And I, as the person who bribed him, I aided and abetted that breach. And I could be liable to shareholders for the breach of loyalty right along with him.
Liable to shareholders of that CEO's company.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that is a very old concept. That's traditional agency law. That's black letter agency law. What Delaware is dealing with now is at what point how does that play out when we're talking about not somebody who bribes a CEO to get a contract, but an acquiring company who is, sort of trying to create conflicts or take advantage of conflicts among the board in order to get them to sell to that acquirer.
Oh, wow. All right, okay. Go ahead.
So, let's play a game. I'm going to do this as if I were teaching you and you were a student in my class. So. Okay.
Oh, you mean in your, which class? Yeah. Securities law?
Well, this would be just basic biz org, so maybe M&A.
BizOrgs, okay. And am I a first, second, third year? What year am I?
You would be a second or third year student.
Is this a big lecture? Do you know who I am?
I know who you are because I'm calling on you. So
okay, great.
We'll start. I'm an acquirer. As we've said, if I go out and bribe the CEO of a target to get them to rig a bidding process for me and direct the company to me, the acquirer, if I go out and I tell the CEO, I'm going to pay you $100,000 if you make me the winning bidder.
Yes.
Then for sure I've aided that CEO's fiduciary breach. So let's just take that as a baseline. That is absolutely aiding and abetting breach. But now, let's say I'm a private equity firm. But instead of bribing the CEO, I just say, hey, CEO, if we acquire your firm, you will work for us after the acquisition.
Okay.
And we pay you based on performance metrics that are very, very easy to meet. And you're going to get huge bonuses if you sell to me. Is that aiding and abetting a fiduciary breach?
I don't know. I would I probably could ask some questions that we don't have time for right here, but okay, so that's the setting. Is that
that's setting, but
go
that's
ahead.
a really simple. That's me going to the CEO and saying, "Hey, if you sell to us, we'll hire you after." Now that's pretty obvious. You can see that the CEO is conflicted. So what if
Right,
the private
sure.
equity firm is a little bit more subtle? I don't say to the CEO, "Hey, we'll hire you after we buy your company." What I do is I make it a practice of hiring CEOs after I buy their company.
Oh, so it's
And
like
I
a
make
pattern.
A pattern. So I make sure that the next CEO knows that this is what I always do.
So when me activist sees a PE firm getting involved in the strategic review that I'm urging somebody to do, and that PE firm always or frequently, as we say, a pattern, hires the incumbent CEO and says, "Okay, you're safe, and we're going to make your life really kind of even a lot easier." You know, PE firms usually as buyers are pretty tough.
Yeah.
But in this case, they're going to say, "Okay, if you kind of stack it in our direction, we're going to make your life pretty cush."
Yeah. And we do that not by openly saying this is what we're going to promise you. They do that by showing, hey, why don't you meet every other CEO that we've dealt with ever? Yeah, exactly. So, or then we can get a little further out. Golden parachutes. The CEO is going to get a huge payout if he sells the company. That's not coming from the buyer. That's coming from the target. I mean, that's something that the target actually created because they want to encourage CEOs to sell. But they can create these conflicts. And so if I'm the acquirer, I might specifically seek out companies where I know that the CEO gets this huge golden parachute, and I intentionally say, "Hey, you know that golden parachute's coming, and don't you think you'd like to sell?" You know, so, and I know that they're thinking about that, and I try to exploit that. So these subtle sets of problems are what the Delaware Supreme Court is grappling with, or the Delaware courts are grappling with.
Okay, so just to kind of recap, though that's probably pretty straightforward. There's arm's length kind of buyer. So we're talking about the target that creates an environment either through past patterns, probably more through past patterns. It'd be pretty easy. They're smarter than
exactly.
kind of put all this in writing. To try to essentially get. And it doesn't have to be a CEO, though. It sounds like it's mostly CEOs. It could be any director.
It's officers who are likely,
Anybody who owes the duty,
like
and it's duty of loyalty. Anybody who owes that duty of loyalty under Delaware law, not just statute, to the target company, we're kind of looking at some of the more subtle examples of how this works. Okay, so go ahead. So I think there was a case now, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that there was So there's one case that was just decided. It was just decided in December. Involved a company called MindBody, and there was a private equity. You know the MindBody, yeah.
Well, I saw the caption. I didn't read the case. I was waiting for that class.
It's marvelous facts. There was a private equity buyer, Vista, and a CEO who really wanted a big payday because he couldn't sell his he had never gotten a big payout for his shares. He had all these shares. He had a 10b5-1 plan, and they were limiting how much he could sell at any particular time.
10b5-1 plan is the plans where insiders can sell on a schedule.
Yeah, exactly. But he said it was something like trying to drink through a very thin straw. Like he really wanted a lot of money, but he couldn't.
He really wanted to dip his beak. He didn't want to just sip.
Exactly. So the buyer, Vista, invites him to attend a conference that Vista was sponsoring, where he could see all the other CEOs talking about
how great a buyer Vista is.
About how, if Vista bought your company, you would get all of this money from essentially the performance of the company post acquisition. So the CEO.
It sounds like recruiting to like a country club, not like buying a company. Okay, go ahead.
So of course the CEO becomes very excited about selling to Vista, and when MindBody starts running a sale process under the CEO's direction, the CEO is back channeling information to Vista, which puts Vista in this position to get a leg up on the bids. The CEO they sign a deal, and there's a go shop, and the CEO is so entirely uninterested in the go shop or finding alternative acquirers that halfway through the go shop, he goes on vacation to Costa Rica.
Oh, wow.
In the middle of the go shop.
So he's running the sale process and no one can find him.
Exactly. He's like, hey, let me know if anything happens. Goodbye. So The shareholders sue, unsurprisingly, saying that this CEO didn't maximize value for shareholders. And they claim both the CEO violated his fiduciary duties and also that Vista, the private equity buyer, aided and abetted these fiduciary breaches.
Sure.
But there was a procedural wrinkle by the time it gets to trial before Chancellor McCormick. So, our favorite couple of judges.
Yes.
It goes to trial before Chancellor McCormick. The whole issue, obviously, is whether Vista corrupted the sales process. But there's also an argument that the proxy statement was misleading because the proxy left out all these details. Like if you're a shareholder voting, you kind of want to know that your CEO is...
The CEO is in Costa Rica. Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the proxy statement was misleading because it left out all of these details. And that's its own fiduciary breach. So the sales process is a fiduciary breach and the false proxy is a fiduciary breach. Whatever reason, I don't know what happened, somehow the plaintiffs end up only arguing that Vista aided the proxy disclosure breaches. They don't somehow maintain a claim that Vista aided the sales process part. So when it goes to the Delaware Supreme Court, the Delaware Supreme Court holds whatever else Vista did or didn't do, it didn't aid and abet the disclosure breach. Because to aid a fiduciary breach, you have to have actively participated in some way. And it's not aiding if you just sit back and watch. You have to actually cultivate a breach. And here, the proxy materials weren't drafted by Vista. They were drafted by this CEO. The merger documents had a kind of standard clause that said Vista was supposed to notify the company if there were any false statements in the proxy. But the Delaware Supreme Court said that's just not good enough. We're not considering whether Vista aided a sales process breach. We're only considering whether it aided the disclosure breach, and sitting back and watching the CEO not disclose enough is not
that
enough
wasn't
for
sufficient for, at least for the Delaware Supreme Court,
it's not
to hold Vista in some sense responsible and liable for this particular breach of duty, for for aiding and abetting. Okay,
for aiding and abetting. So the CEO's on the hook both for the sales process and for the false proxy. But Vista is off the hook entirely. But we don't know, because the Delaware Supreme Court didn't have to get to, and no court ever get to, whether Vista could have been held liable for aiding the sales process breach. The fact that he wasn't running the process to really maximize value for shareholders. So that's mind-body.
So that was the mind-body case again, and we saw the caption come out in the past few weeks, I think.
Yeah, it came out in December.
Is there other similar...
Yeah.
There's got to be another similar cases here.
Exactly. So there's one more that's pending before the Delaware Supreme Court, and it's going to be decided, sometime. It hasn't even been argued yet. It'll be decided in 2025. And this is the Columbia Pipeline case. So the CEO and the CFO of Columbia Pipeline, they both were older. They wanted to get their golden parachutes, change of control benefits, and retire. And it's kind of this complicated set of facts. The parties are still arguing really about what actually happened. But essentially, these two guys favored TransCanada's bid for Columbia Pipeline because they thought it was high enough to be credible. They could close quickly. They didn't want to bargain because they just wanted out and get their change of control benefits. And the claim here is that TransCanada knew all this. TransCanada could see that these guys were favoring them. They were giving them internal bargaining points. They were getting ahead of the board. There's the whole thing where TransCanada kept breaching a standstill, and these guys ignored it and let them keep breaching the standstill, even though other bidders were still locked up. So basically, TransCanada knows it's being favored. And eventually, TransCanada reaches an agreement in principle for $26 a share. And then we don't know how. There's a leak about these negotiations, and that leak puts a lot of pressure on the company to finalize the deal. At that point, TransCanada threatens to publicly announce that the negotiations have ended, which would have violated the standstills, unless Columbia Pipeline agrees to lower the price from $26 to $25.50. And Columbia Pipeline agrees, accepts this lower bid. They had a sort of handshake deal on 26. Columbia Pipeline says, okay, you're threatening us, we'll make it $25.50. And that's the point, Laster says, that TransCanada crossed the line into aiding and abetting. Because up until then, what it had done was sort of cultivated a kind of pliancy in these two officers. It knew these officers were compromised. It pressed them with these standstill breaches. It manipulated them into position. And then it all came to a head when TransCanada kind of exploited their eagerness to sell with this threat to
lowering the
price.
So there was some more. So there was some very definable damages. It looks like
exactly. That's exactly what he did. That Laster concluded that this drop in price was in fact the damages. So, but there's a real question, and that's why they're appealing. TransCanada is saying this is not a fiduciary breach. This is sharp bargaining. We offered a price.
Shrewd negotiation. Yeah,
but
right.
last year's view was you knew that these guys weren't really bargaining on behalf of the company, and you exploited that to get that to pressure them to accept a lower price. And that is sort of where we are, and we'll see if what the Delaware Supreme Court.
So he then awarded he found in favor of the plaintiffs in this Columbia Pipeline one.
Exactly.
Got it.
So that's why TransCanada is appealing. I think the officers actually settled.
All right. So
yeah.
And Mindbody's done.
Mindbody's done, but only with respect to that question about disclosure. We got no ruling. So now what Columbia Pipeline does is it presents the ability for the court to start talking seriously about when is it aiding and abetting for the actual whole run of the process.
Okay, in all the different ways and forms, a VC, a buyer, some sort of third party, arm's length bid or whatever can interfere or somehow create or encourage a breach of fiduciary duty.
Exactly.
Oh wow! So that'll be later.
That'll be in 2025.
Next year's almost here.
Yeah. Well, we're recording this at the very end of December, but so this will be a couple months into 2025.
So it'll happen pretty quick.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll just say that like the reason this fascinates me is like obviously there's this nitty-gritty question of like what's the line between like sharp dealing and like bribing the officer. Like it's really hard to figure out where some of those lines are. But there's actually this bigger meta issue. We have said repeatedly on this podcast that there's all this turmoil about whether Delaware's being too strict in its governance standards, whether it's imposing too many constraints on corporate managers. And the issue is that Delaware has, I think Delaware's developed a set of legal standards that don't mesh very well with the practices that have grown up around venture capital and private equity. And I think that these cases are sort of a continuation of that problem. So TransCanada is not a private equity case. That's like just normal companies.
Right, Mindbody certainly was that.
But Mindbody was, and the TransCanada issues are PE issues. This golden parachute problem. That's exactly what PE does. They look for companies that have CEOs with golden parachutes, and they try to exploit that. And they couple that with exactly what Vista did. Look at how well we treat our CEOs. Don't you want to sell to us? That's industry practice. So I think this entire line of cases involving aiding and abetting, it actually got started several years ago when investment banks were found to have aided fiduciary breaches, mostly in the context of PE buyouts. So now we have these other cases that are also raising questions about some private equity standard practices. And I think this is a running theme in Delaware of how much Delaware's sort of well-developed body of case law was really not designed for the private equity
this PE
era.
or at least how the PE world has kind of evolved in sort of the recent past.
Exactly. So this is just one example. Director independence, controlling shareholders, all those issues are basically shareholder agreements. These are all issues that are like developed in the PE space, and now they're running smack into Delaware law.
Or Delaware's avowed goal of helping protect shareholders.
Exactly.
In this way. Whoa, that's interesting. So, Professor, how'd I do?
You did fine.
Oh, thank you.
You know a lot about how these things work.
I just want to pass. I just want to go on winter break, okay? Please. Anyway, so speaking of winter break and breaks, let's take one of those.
Shareholder Primacy is brought to you by FreeFlowAnalytics.com, the only free database of corporate directors, their influence, and their performance. If you own a stock or retirement plan, go to FreeFlowAnalytics.com and look up which of your elected directors are performing well and which aren't. Use your vote in the alternative democracy and get your data at FreeFlowAnalytics.com. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Shareholder Primacy. I'm Ann Lipton here with Mike Levin. So, Mike, we've talked before about buying votes, and now we've kind of seen this sort of poor relation issue of empty voting, and a really dramatic example of it. So, what was going on with Massimo and Politan Capital?
Well, it was a wonderful example of empty voting, which is defined in some way. There's no really great definition of it, but it's sort of, voting shares where you don't have the underlying economic ownership of the shares. And there's all sorts of different ways people have thought about it. We've talked about that a little bit in the past. But this activist situation really brought it home in some really fascinating ways. And it, of course, involved Massimo Corporation, a tech company that in fact sells the blood oxygen monitors to Apple for Apple Watches. Famously secretive, famously competitive. CEO Joe Chiani was a visionary in this little bit of biotechnology. Anyway, so they got in the radar of Politan Capital, Quentin Coffey, a guy we know, who in 2023 succeeded in winning a proxy vote for 2 out of the 6 seats on a classified board. Wow. So not Quentin, but 2 other people.
2 of his nominees.
Were 2 of his nominees were on the board at Massimo at the 2023 annual shareholder meeting. And then instead of sort of just settling there, Quentin's a pretty ambitious and pretty clever dude. He also, because he won his seats in an outright election, there was no standstill agreement, there was no settlement, there was no nothing. He could do whatever he wanted. And he was clearly not happy with the direction of the company, even with 2 out of 6 seats. And so early in 2024, he duly noticed and nominated 2 other candidates, including himself and 1 other person. And so if this succeeded, Politan's 4 people would control the 6-person board. Okay. And clearly that made Joe Chiani a little nervous. So some things started to happen. So
one thing you could do is run the company better, take advice, or
you could do what he did, which was try in some evidently some very underhanded ways to try to make sure try to help Coffey lose this, Politan lose this. So what they did, it wasn't quite clear until only a couple months. The annual meeting was in, I think, May. And it wasn't quite clear until several months later exactly what I'm about to describe happened. But in the meantime, Politan Capital is running this proxy contest. They got proxy materials out and they're counting votes. And right away, Politan started noticing some weird stuff. So Glass Lewis came out with its voting recommendation to support the Politan nominees, and in its report said it looks like there's some shareholder that is really urging us to make a recommendation a certain way and saying they own shares that they don't. We're not sure they own. Okay, and so there was some funny business going on, and Politan issued a news release like sometime in May, saying we urge the company to sort of investigate this. And that sort of, the company sort of responded, said, you're crazy, we're above board. Interestingly, the AGM got moved. For whatever reason, which we found out a little later, the company's...
Politan starts poking around, and
and they said we think there's some examples of empty voting going on. We don't really know, but we really want the board to investigate, and we really urge the company to move the annual meeting and declare a new record date. And the company ended up doing that, and so the AGM ended up moving to September. In September, Politan's 2 nominees win, and so Quentin Coffey and another person get on the board, and right away some really interesting things happen very quickly. Joe Chiani, CEO, leaves within like a week, and everyone starts threatening to sue each other. But that's kind of all we knew. And then
one thing I'll say, though, I just have to point out that normally when I teach students about staggered boards, I tell them it's kind of impossible to win, to take, successfully win 2 success proxy contests, like that it hadn't ever been, like that,
this
essentially
is really
it's impossible
unusual.
So the fact that I think it's probably still true when you're talking about somebody who wants to acquire a company, because you can't wait that long. I think but as an activist who just wants to sort of take over in a different way, he really could invest and win 2 successive proxy contests.
This showed extraordinary patience and fortitude. It also helped that he already had 2 people on the board before who were able to report, because it was not a settlement, because they won an outright election, they could sort of sell anything they wanted. They could tell, share all sorts of information with Politan and with so on and so forth. So it clearly made it a lot easier for Politan to win, or at least run a second contest. It also helped that, Kiani was, famously standoffish to shareholders and so forth. So, anyway, so we saw, we kind of, everyone in the activist community kind of suspected there was this empty voting going, but we really didn't know until a couple lawsuits came out. The second lawsuit, which we don't need to talk about, is Politan continues to sue Kiani over his golden parachute. Speaking of golden parachute.
Which is just so fantastic because this happened a couple times where like somebody wins the contest and then sues everybody like who resisted. I mean, like taking over a company and then suing the people who sort of made your life difficult. Well, Elon Musk did it when he was forced to buy. Well, Elon Musk is suing Wattel because he was forced to buy Twitter.
Well, of course.
I think, Carl Icahn once took over a company over their resistance and then sued.
Sued all the former
exactly.
People,
I mean, it's a very
it's great.
Taking over a company and then suing the people who you fought with before is just is a thing.
Delicious revenge. Anyway, so their second lawsuit again was against Kiani because I can't remember if that was a countersue, whatever, but they're suing over his severance package. The first one revealed a lot, and the facts and the allegations were fascinating. The first lawsuit is against Kiani, but also against this investor. It's called RTW Capital, which is a good friend of Kiani's. He's on their website saying how they're great wealth managers, and he's been a guest at their conferences and so forth. And the facts in the complaint, at least, revealed a lot more what was going on. It revealed that the first time, when the annual meeting was in May, that Kiani had divulged the record date to RTW. RTW at that point had owned a little under 3% of the common, and quickly increased their exposure to just under 10%, just under a couple disclosure thresholds. And at the same time put on shorts for the increase in their position, which, on the one hand is just responsible portfolio management. On the other hand, sort of betrays a little bit of a lack of confidence in Kiani if only short.
Yeah, if you completely just bought shares and completely got rid of all your economic interest, then that's just straight up. That is the definition of empty voting. Right,
and then a week later, they sold all the shares, reversed the short, and after voting the shares, and then the meeting got postponed. That's what. So that first instance is what Politan and its proxy solicitor had sort of detected. And the facts in the complaint is a great read here. I don't read many of these because I'm not the lawyer. But there's some really good facts there about how right now. So they unwound the shorts, and then had to go do it all over again because the meeting got moved to September.
So they did it again.
They did it
even
again.
after they got caught. They had to move the record date because they got caught, and they did it again.
And again, they didn't actually kind of get caught. They were kind of accused.
Okay.
But then they did it again, and even then. Politan prevailed in the vote.
So they both engaged in empty voting and did it badly.
So even with probably 15 or 16% between Kiani and RTW's empty vote, and the empty voting, of course, was was how was RTW voting shares, voting 10% of shares, owning only 3%, so this or 2%. So the 7% was kind of empty. Anyway, so. So Politan then sued RTW, but the lawsuit's interesting. The accusation is only kind of two kind of basic claims or accusations. The second had to do with short swing profits. Basically, they formed a group. They were accused of going over the short swing profit threshold, and because Kiani's an insider and RTW was affiliated, they said we don't know what the amount of short swing profits are, and you have to do that anytime you're trading on a short time frame. If you make money, you got to give money to the company. Go ahead.
Right. So Kiani's an insider, and the idea is the accusations I understand it is by creating this empty voting scheme, sort of coordinated with RTW, the two of them became a group, and as a group that I think owned more than 10% together.
Yes.
And Kiani's also an insider. They are subject to the short swing profit rule that says you have to disgorge any profits made or losses avoided if you rapidly buy and sell within a 6-month period. So it's their conspiracy made them all one and subject to this rule.
Right. And so the first allegation that was able to enable this was they formed a group. They formed a 13D group that they did not disclose, that they were coordinating.
By coordinating, they formed a group. They didn't disclose that was a group, and that's its own SEC violation.
Right.
And that's the one that, again, Elon Musk is being sued, like the...
Oh, in Twitter, right. When he bought Twitter, he said, he filed a G instead of a D.
Yeah. So they're not disclosing that they were this group, and then simultaneously, I guess, because they were a group, not disgorging their short swing profits.
Correct. So those are the two kind of accusations in the case. The case obviously is going to go to discovery, and they're going to do all the things that cases do until they possibly settle. But interesting, a settlement isn't going to amount to much here. The penalties.
This is about revenge.
Yeah, right. And what's interesting is that the settlement of the 13D, failure to form a group. Normally, if there's a 13D violation, that's a disclosure problem, and then the response to that's more disclosure.
And it's a tiny little fine from the SEC. It's actually not really enforceable by like private. I think that the short swing profits is really where they get money. And even that's not going to be a lot.
And the short swing profits is going to be a lot, and the shares didn't move a ton. I mean, I looked at it a little bit.
This is just anger.
Right. Well, interestingly, there's two other points I want to make. First, at no point, at least in the legal arguments here, is anyone saying that empty voting is illegal?
Because nobody knows. It's so unclear.
Right. Yeah. So, but there's no accusation that the actual act of trying to vote shares you don't own was
or you don't have economic
broke some law.
Yeah.
There's no Delaware law, there's no federal law.
There's certainly no federal law against it. And Delaware really tries to avoid ruling because it's so hard to figure out what to do about that.
So we have another, a very clear example of someone buying and selling votes, basically, where we're not going to get any kind of legal ruling about whether. And the second thing is all this took place after Politan won
the first round.
The second round.
Oh, the last,
and won the majority. Yeah, I mean, all the facts in this complaint. Everything that we learned about the empty voting and how many shares that RTW and who at RTW was doing it and how they knew each other. This wasn't because there was some sort of discovery process. This is because Quentin Coffey was on the board and was able to get like Joe Chiani's cell phone records and all sorts of internal emails and communications. And in the complaint, there's like this photograph of a count of votes as they're coming in of a whiteboard. All this was company records.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And clearly
they're taking notes on a criminal conspiracy.
Exactly. Politan found all this and said, "Oh man, this complaint kind of writes itself."
That's marvelous.
So anyway, I'm very intrigued, or we all are intrigued in how these kind of voting things kind of work, and some of the legality. We'd love for Delaware to kind of rule on this, but unfortunately, it's not going to happen. This is all federal at this point because both the short swing profit and the 13D violations are all federal statute, but we'll have to see what happens there.
Yeah.
So that was the most recent fun example of empty voting and kind of again I commend the complaint and the facts in the complaint. It's pretty easy to read. To everyone listening here. It's really kind of cool.
Yeah.
So that was what happened at Massimo and with Politan.
That's great.
So we'll
That's
see
a great
how
story.
that works out, isn't it?
No.
I think we've had enough of this. I think we can maybe wrap up. How's that sound?
All right.
All right, Ann. It's terrific talking once again. This is Shareholder Primacy, hosted by Ann Lipton and me, Mike Levin. I'm an activist investor and advisor to investors about their activist situations. Ann is the Michael M. Fleischman Professor in Business Law and Entrepreneurship at Tulane Law School and an affiliate of Tulane's Murphy Institute. You can find me, Mike, at theactivistinvestor.com and Ann at law.tulane.edu. Our podcast is produced and distributed by Free Float Media. Thanks for listening. We will talk again